that's kind of a separate hypothesis than that there is no creator, and
Yes.
not only that, but that in some sense, you use this word yourself, that the belief in that is a delusion, which has a lot of harmful consequences and presumably should be resisted.
Yes, I mean, of course, sophisticated theologians have no problem with evolution, and it's an insult to them to bracket them in with the fundamentalist idiots who think that North America is 8 yards wide. So we have sophisticated theologians who are totally comfortable with the idea that life has evolved, but somehow see the hand of a designer, maybe in the universe as a whole, maybe in framing the laws of physics. Maybe some believe that a designer anticipated that evolution would happen and set up the universe in such a way that it would. These are much more sophisticated ideas. I don't find them persuasive, and though they're certainly a lot more persuasive than the fundamentalists, I don't find them persuasive because I think that they're undermining the very achievement that we attribute to Darwin correctly. Before Darwin came along, the big problem was how we got life, how life is as complicated as it is. And William Paley himself, the great natural theologian, said as much. He said that the really strong evidence for the creator comes in the living world. The physical world is sort of secondary. Now that Darwin and his successors have solved the biological problem, we're left with things like the origin of the cosmos, the origin of the universe, the origin of the laws of physics, and the origin of life, which is a chemical problem. To me, those always were the small problems, but however, we are still faced with them. But I think it's a foolhardy, almost a cowardly act to fall back on the same kind of explanation as Darwin exploded when it was the big problem that we faced. What Darwin achieved with the big problem ought to be a cautionary tale warning us not to fall into the same trap of saying, oh, I don't understand it, therefore there must have been a designer who did it. We got that wrong over life. We got that wrong until the middle of the 19th century. Now that the big problem has been solved, that ought to be a lesson to us. Don't fall into the same trap again. Don't fall into the trap of thinking that because we don't yet understand something, therefore it must have been designed. If you think back to the question of, I was talking about statistical improbability. The statistical improbability problem in the case of life yielded to the gradual slope of Mount Improbable. That was solved. But if an eye is statistically improbable, how much more statistically improbable would an intelligence capable of designing an eye, or designing the laws of physics, designing a universe, designing quantum theory? You have simply erected a new problem, which is analogous to the problem of explaining eyes. You've really not got an answer at all. It simply isn't an explanation at all to suddenly invoke a creative intelligence which must have the same properties of statistical improbability as living things do. It's an invasion, it's a cowardly invasion, it's lazy. What we should be doing as scientists is rolling up our sleeves and saying, right, Darwin solved the big one, now let's take that as encouragement to solve the remaining problems, things like the origin of life and the origin of the cosmos.
So I do want to leave time for questions from the audience, but maybe I'll ask you a question about the idea of memes in this context of science and religion. So you've introduced this idea of meme as a kind of a self-replicating piece of thought. And in The God Delusion, you talk about how fundamentalist religion is kind of like a complex of memes, which is, if you were to think of it in evolutionary terms, particularly well defended and suited to survival. And is it fair to put science and maybe enlightenment and rational thought into the same category as the similarly constructed
I suppose you
and
could, yes.
Are they in evolutionary competition, and is science sure to win?
I suppose you could do that. I mean, I should say that the mean was never intended to be a theory of human culture. It was the last chapter of the first edition of The Selfish Gene. The second edition has a couple more chapters. But it was the last chapter of the first edition. And it was intended, I intended it as an antidote, because the whole book had been pushing the gene to center stage as the immortal replicator. And I wanted to make the point that the immortal replicator is the unit of natural selection all over the universe. And if you go to Mars, if you go to Alpha Centauri 3, whatever it is, and find life, you're going to find something like DNA. But maybe we don't have to go to Mars. Maybe there's something a bit like DNA staring us in the face on this planet. Imitation from one human brain to another, or one non-human brain to another for that matter, it's a bit like DNA. I mean, when you learn a tune, if I whistle a tune and you catch the tune, we call it a catchy tune. You catch the tune and you whistle it, and then somebody hears you whistle it and they whistle it, and so it kind of spread through a crowd. Or a fashion, like wearing a baseball hat backwards, or a fashion like using the word basically about 3 times in every sentence. These you could think of as being replicating entities, a bit like DNA. Now, it's a separate question whether, I mean, there's no doubt they are replicating entities. It's a separate question whether they're evolutionarily interesting, whether there is a natural selection of genes. I think there is. I mean, I think that some tunes are catchier than others, and some habits, some styles of dress, even learning words. I mean, the words of a language are self-replicating. But is there a Darwinian selection in any interesting sense? And you suggested that maybe religions are, well, I suggested.
I think you suggested.
That maybe religions are mean complexes, and I should back up and say that gene complexes are immensely important. And when I was talking about the selfish gene, I should have mentioned that genes don't work in isolation. I mean, they may be selfish in the sense I just defined, but they are cooperative in the sense that cartels of mutually supportive, mutually compatible genes are selected because they work well in the context of each other. So when we say compare the genes of lions and antelopes, both sets are doing fundamentally the same job, which is getting passed on to the next generation. But the carnivorous way of life of the lions is very different from the herbivorous way of life of the antelopes. So genes that are suited to the carnivorous way of life are naturally selected in each other's company against the context of each other. They do well against the context of each other. The carnivore genes go well together, the herbivore genes go well together. If they were mixed, if they were somehow transplanted one to the other, they very likely wouldn't work. And so we can talk about gene complexes. In the same way, there might be mean complexes that go well together in just the same way. And a well-worked out religion like Mormonism or Roman Catholicism could be thought of as a mean complex, a collection of means which work well in each other's presence in the context of each other, but don't work well when one is transplanted into the other. So that's a kind of vaguely promising line of thought, but as I say, I didn't really ever intend it to be a contribution to the theory of human culture. I'm not that ambitious.